few minutes past 1, so I think we'll get started. Thanks very much for coming along to our first GCRF AFRICAP Seminar. My name's Helen Cosker and I'm the Programme Support Officer for AFRICAP. Before I say a little bit more about the programme, just the format for today. As you know, we've got two presentations by 3 presenters, which will run back to back. That should take about 30 minutes, and that will leave us with a good amount of time for your questions. We have the live audience here in Leeds. We also have a number of attendees through our webinar facilities who will be able to submit questions in writing. So I'm hoping that both audiences will have an opportunity to ask their burning questions. We're filming, just so you're all aware, we'll be filming the first few minutes so that the webinar attendees can see the presenters, and then we'll switch off the video just not to test our luck with bandwidth. So AFRICAP is funded by the UK Government's Global Challenges Research Fund. Our lead partner is FANRAPAN, based in South Africa. That's the Food, Agriculture and Natural Resources Policy Analysis Network. And they've co-organised this seminar and webinar with us. Our other partners are the Civil Society Agriculture Network in Malawi, the National Agricultural Marketing Council of South Africa, the Economic and Social Research Council of Tanzania, the Agricultural Consultative Forum of Zambia, and then our UK partners, Chatham House, University of Aberdeen, and the UK Met Office. AFRICAP aims to make agriculture and food production in sub-Saharan Africa more productive and resilient to climate change. And we're doing this by first gathering evidence on the present-day agri-food systems in 4 focal countries in sub-Saharan Africa. So that's Malawi, South Africa, Tanzania, and Zambia. We'll then be modelling pathways to future economic growth and food security, and using both these to design new policies that enable climate-smart agricultural development. Another important part of what we're doing is encouraging capacity building and knowledge sharing among our AFRICAP team members and beyond, which is what brings us to today. So I'd like to ask our first presenters, Dr. Harriet Smith and Dr. Joseph Galani, Research Fellows here at the University of Leeds, to introduce their presentation.
Thank you, Helen. So thank you everybody for both coming in person and online to our inaugural seminar. It's quite exciting. And to kick things off, we're going to be talking through our household vulnerability survey, which has been the culmination of about 8 months' work by pretty much everybody on the AFRICAP team inputting into the survey. Joseph and I have coordinated from the lead side, but we are presenting on behalf of everybody. So the overall aim of the survey is to evaluate the vulnerability and resilience of farming households to climate change, bearing in mind their agricultural production systems, food safety and nutritional security. So we are aiming to survey over 1,500 households across 4 countries, so working out at about 400 households per country. And we are also aiming to do a repeat survey to look at seasonality within the food secure and insecure periods. So our 4 AFRICAP focal countries are South Africa, Zambia, Tanzania and Malawi. And whilst we're still at the moment deliberating over the final locations for the household survey, we're kind of zooming in and focusing down on some areas. So within South Africa, we're hoping maybe to work in the Free State, largely because in this area they've got kind of the start of something called an agri-park, which is an innovation system linking production, processing, logistics and extension services for rural transformation. In Zambia, we're looking at Chibomba, Makushi districts, and both are kind of up and coming areas for soy production, with both large and small scale production models. In Tanzania, we're looking at Tanga region, largely because it's quite a diverse region and represents all of Tanzania's agroclimatic zones. So within Tanzania in particular, we're looking at kind of small scale climate vulnerability. And then last but not least, in Malawi, we are looking at Balaka and Kota districts due to kind of ongoing work with conservation agricultural extension programs run through CIMMYT. And in particular, Balaka is a high-risk area to climate change.
Well, The survey we will be running during the Africa project in those 4 countries Harriet has listed previously has been built upon another survey that was run by FANAPAN. FANAPAN is an agricultural network working on agriculture and policy in South Africa. So they have run what they have called a HAVA survey, a household assessment and household assets and vulnerability assessment survey in South Africa, working on agriculture and HIV/AIDS on those populations. So from that survey, we have developed this one that includes different group of different topics from different disciplines. And you can see we go from food science, safety and nutrition, to farming, livestock, gender, agriculture, soil science, plant science and ecology, and also climate and crop modeling. So the cross-disciplinary design has been done, including researchers from all those different teams all together. And after the survey has been designed, a piloting was performed. That's what we mean by in-country engagement. The survey has been piloted in Malawi with a small focus group of farmers there. So during the piloting, the aspect of the survey that was tested included the wording and the vocabulary, because the survey, the questionnaire has been prepared in English, but it's going to be run in local languages. In this case, Malawi, it was Chichewa. So it was here to make sure that the words that we have in English will be translated in the local language in such a way that the household could be able to understand and give back the real answer that we are looking for. The sensitivity was also another aspect look here, especially, for example, with the gender issues. For a woman answering some gender-sensitive question to get in front of her husband was sometimes very sharp to consider. And we can also, another element of sensitivity when we are looking for their assets, for people to tell you how much they are earning, how they are spending their money, it's also another sensitive topic. The structure of the survey itself was checked in order to make sure that the questions are not being repeated from different research groups, and to make sure that there is a coherence in the way we are asking the question to make the interview smooth with its flow. Also, because it's a large survey involving different research groups, there's a lot of data we want to acquire. The survey was quite long and it took time. So after the first piloting, all those remarks have been taken back and they were used to optimize the survey to make it more easy to implement them. So the survey now has 10 different modules, which are what you can see on this slide. The first modules A and B are looking for the general information about the household that will be interviewed, their demographic and some general information. Then there are modules regarding farming systems in general. And in this module, we have the module C looking at agriculture, land holding, then module D dealing with crop cultivation system, and E with livestock system. There is then the module F that is concerned with the household well-being, income, and assets. Then the module G is looking for household nutrition and food security. Then comes the social science module that will evaluate the gender-sensitive agriculture and women empowerment. Then we will question about the aflatoxin as awareness that will be connected with nutrition and crop cultivation system, and also with livestock system. And at the end of the survey, we are checking questions regarding shock, coping, and adaptation to understand how these households are prepared and to respond or to cope with the climate change shock. Like, for example, let's say a sudden drought happening and all their crop are gone, they are not able to have enough food. How are they prepared, or how are they ready to cope with that?
So the way that we are collecting the data is through an open source online program called Open Data Kit, and essentially it's free, and you can upload your survey via programming or via an Excel document. You pop it on the internet, and then you can download it onto tablets and smartphones. And so we'll have a small army of enumerators in every country with this on their smartphones, and they kind of click through and answer the questions. So multiple choice, they just click the multiple choice, or they can type in kind of more qualitative response. And then the data gets automatically uploaded onto a server, which FANRAPAN is managing, and then we can kind of remotely manage the data quality as it comes through straight from the field. This is still me. Right, so the survey, as you may have guessed, is quite large, quite complicated, and with the complexity of working across 4 different countries, potentially all at the same time, we have put together a number of protocols to kind of minimize risk, and in an attempt to have coherence amongst the data that we're collecting. So initially, before we even start data collection, obviously we have enumerator training in each of the countries where they will have an opportunity to have a look at the survey, go through, get to grips with kind of the data and the information that's being asked, and then have a practice trial and run with it on their smartphones or tablets. And then with the translations, as Joseph's already mentioned, so in each of our countries there are local languages. In some, like Zambia, there are at least 4 in the districts that the 2 districts that we're working across. And so in an attempt to kind of ensure that our English survey is translated, we've got a 6-step process for translations. So it's an initial translation in the field and piloting, which we've already done in Malawi, in Chichewa, and then kind of piloting and amending as necessary, and then translating the translated survey back into English to compare against the original script, and then obviously any adjustments that need to be made are made and then tested again. So it's an iterative process. That is the plan. And then we've got a 24-hour dietary recall within the survey itself, and we've got a protocol that's been adapted from King's College London, from a survey that they did with the UK Food Standards Agency. So we've adapted that for kind of the more local sub-Saharan African context.
Well, about the anthropometry, together with the survey, the anthropometry data mean body weight, height, and middle upper arm circumference of women and children in the household will be measured. That will be connected with other data to understand how aflatoxin contamination, for example, and how the maize nutritional content of the maize they are consuming impacts on their health parameters. So at the same time, maize will be sampled from the household. The protocol is being prepared for maize sampling, depending on where or at what level of their maize cropping we're gonna get the maize. For example, if it's still on the field, there's a protocol for sampling in the field. There's another one for sampling maize that has been harvested already and who is, for example, on the threshing yard. There's another protocol for maize that has been stored already. At the same time, for livestock study, different samples are going to be performed depending on the farming operation that are found in those households. So there is a protocol for sampling the feed, either separated or mixed feed ready to be eaten by the animals. There will be also milk sampling in the morning and evening, provided that those animal farms are milking twice a day. And together also mine manure will be sampled. That will help understanding how the milk they are producing is important for their health, and also the aflatoxin content of the feed and the milk and the manure will be studied to see the interaction among all these. Well, all the survey we are planning to conduct feed into the global work of the Africa project, which is divided into 4 themes that you will find in the 4 circles on this slide. So regarding the training and capacity building, for example, we are looking for engaging students and other researchers in the countries where the survey will be, the project will be implemented, and also students here in Leeds, so that they can be capacity building in terms of training, in terms of having some students doing their master and PhD within the program. That has been done already, and we believe more will be also done. We are also working in collaboration with a local organization that are supporting us in implementing the survey. About the capacity building in research, also we are looking for collaborating with scientific groups in the different countries. For example, we are looking for strengthening the capacity in laboratory analysis. And just to mention here that there is a large range of capacity building activities that are being planned, and the capacity building is reciprocal. In the same time, we are strengthening the capacity, we are also learning from them, so it's vice versa. About the farming system, the different aspects of the farming system that will be evaluated or assessed during AFRICAP work is displayed. It starts from evaluating conservation agriculture, which is one of the agricultural strategy which is being advised now in order to respond efficiently to climate change. We will also evaluate social, ecological farm flow, post-harvest, food safety and nutrition, crop breeding and seed system, households vulnerability when we are looking for their assets and their capacity to cope to climate change. We will be also looking for innovation and intervention of climate smart food system.
So through the household survey and through the different projects that are planned and ongoing in the farming systems theme, this will ultimately feed into the 2 other themes, the climate smart development pathways, which Sarah will be talking a bit more about some of the methods in the next presentation, and also policy design and implementation. So, for example, with Tanzania, our hope is that the household data that we're gathering will be a baseline vulnerability data that could be picked up by local kind of district and regional planning, for example. So moving on to our challenges and potentially some of the limitations with something so complex and large. Joe?
Well, one of the main challenge that we encounter here is that we have a cross-disciplinary team. There are people from different backgrounds, including food science and nutrition, climate, social sciences, ecology, plant sciences, and many other groups working together and putting all the ideas together. So putting all this together has been a big challenge, because people from those different groups see things differently. They have their own requirement, they have their own protocol, they have their own strategy of doing research. So putting that together into one survey was a big challenge. So the strategy we have adopted, practically speaking, was to put a draft of the survey online, and people were contributing all together, and we end up actually having a good collaborative team. And at a certain point, we had to compromise, because in some aspects, people were really having different opinions. People were really interested in having the data in a different way, in a different form, in a different scale. So we had to compromise. For example, when we were looking for the food consumption, some groups were interested in having 7 days food consumption, where others will be looking for the 24 hours recall. So after discussing and compromising, we finally decided to go for 24 hours recall. The other thing was the multi-scale of this program, which is large. It goes from the tiny scale you can imagine of seed, studying seeds, up to looking at climate change at the continent level. So that is the challenges of moving from a small scale to a very large scale. So we also had another difficulty with the in-country research framework. We are implementing a project in 4 African countries together with the UK, and we needed, for example, the ethics required at the University of Leeds has been obtained, but in those countries, each of those countries may have its own ethical requirement that we need to also go through. Another aspect was, for example, the research permit in Tanzania. We need a research permit to work there through their Department of their Commission of Science and Technology. While in Malawi, we do not need a research permit as far as we have in-country partners that collaborate with us and make sure that we work according to what their government their government's requirement. In Zambia and South Africa, that is also another different story. So we have to deal with those different research framework put in place in all those different countries.
And in addition to kind of the paperwork side of things, the realities of transforming a survey that scientists want into the realities of the way that farmers live their lives was a whole other matter. So, for example, we had requirements here to get kind of data in kilograms per hectares, but the reality is that people are putting inputs in their land in handfuls or capfuls or buckets. So we are devising kind of a unit conversion from local units to kind of more standardized units that can be plugged into models or things like that. As we've already said, the survey was initially enormous. We've whittled it down to about 2 hours, which is still quite long. So we're kind of playing around with the idea of swapping in and out modules, so not every single household will be asked every single question, in a way to kind of reduce the burden on participants. Another thing is the kind of timing of the survey, in that because we're looking at kind of different seasonal times and people will have different requirements in the field during the harvest, it's quite a lot to expect people to take minimum 2 hours out of their day to be pestered by us effectively. So taking those things into consideration, perhaps recruitment will be a little bit more difficult in the field, but we wait and see. And then obviously again with the translations is an ongoing challenge, and with Zambia particularly because we've got 4 different languages to deal with, potentially translating a survey 4 times for one country is not feasible. So we're looking at other ways to minimize the risk of different questions being asked in a different way, and instead having a glossary of key terms or specific key questions only being translated as opposed to the entire thing. That's us. Thank you very much. I think, Sarah, you're next.
Great, thanks very much, Harriet and Joseph. We've got questions coming in from our webinar participants, which is great. Please keep sending them and we'll address them after the next presentation, which is by Dr. Sarah Chapman, also a research fellow on AFRICAP here at the University of Leeds.
Hi everyone, so I'm going to talk more about the climate modelling aspect of AFRICAP. Our goal is to look at how climate change will impact on agriculture in the AFRICAP countries. So for example, will the climate become more or less favourable to the major food crops in these countries? At the moment we're focusing on Tanzania and the Tanga region. As Harriet said, the Tanga region represents all of the major agroecological zones in Tanzania, and it's also quite interesting from a climate perspective. It's on the border of the bimodal and unimodal rainfall regimes, and it's also got the mountains and the coast. So quite a lot of interesting things are happening in a small area in Tanga. So to look at how climate change will impact on agriculture, we need to know what are the most important aspects of climate to agriculture, and we need to know how they'll change in the future and why. So we're using 2 models to look at this, the CP4 and P25 models. These are regional climate models, so rather than modelling the entire globe, they look at a regional area at a higher resolution and get the boundary conditions from a global model. So that figure there, that just shows the domain of the CP4 model and the topography. CP4 is also a convective permitting model, which means it has a better representation of storms than the P25 model. So we think it should do better at looking at rainfall. As most of the agriculture in these countries is rain-fed, we're hoping that CP4 will be quite useful to look at how climate change might impact on agriculture. Before looking at the future climate, however, we need to know how well the models are performing in the present climate. So to do this, we compare the models to observations. East Africa is quite a data-sparse region. So rather than using weather stations and rain gauges, I use satellite data. There are quite a few satellite products available for rainfall, but they all differ from each other a bit, especially when it comes to extremes. Most of them struggle over mountainous areas, and there are a few mountains in East Africa. The satellite I chose to go with was the TRIM satellite. It tends to perform well in comparisons between the different satellite products, but it still underestimates precipitation over mountainous areas, and it also tends to underestimate high-intensity precipitation in East Africa. So far, we've compared the model to observations for the onset of the rainy season and for some indices of extreme rainfall, so consecutive wet and dry days and intense rainfall. And all of these indices should be quite important to agriculture in this region. So this here shows the onset. So to calculate onset, I used Dunning's 2016 method. So I won't go into the details here, but the important thing about this is that it works on an individual grid cell basis, which means it can be applied over a broad area. So the first column there just shows the onset from the TRIM satellite data. So blue is January, yellow is December, and then the other two columns show the comparison with the model. The first row is showing the unimodal and the short rains, and the second row is showing the unimodal areas with the long rains. Most of that region is actually in the unimodal area, so those two rows are quite similar, except near the equator where you have the bimodal rainfall area. So CP4 and P25 are performing quite similarly for onset, and they're also doing a similar job as other regional climate models in this area. In Tanzania, they're doing reasonably well, and CP4 is within about 20 days of the TRIM satellite onset for about 3/4 of the grid cells. They aren't doing well everywhere, however. So this is just the same figure as before, but it's focused on Tanzania. And you can see in the blue and the red areas, the models aren't doing as well. Those areas are on the boundary of the unimodal and the bimodal rainfall areas. So the models are doing well in most places, but they're not getting that boundary quite right. As for why this is happening, in CP4 on the northern coast of Tanzania during the short rains, so October through to December, there's a little bit of a dry bias in the model, and that's when it should be picking up the short rains. As for why this is happening, in both models during that time, the winter monsoon winds, which bring cold and dry air into East Africa, are starting about a month too early. So I haven't shown these winds here, but they're present in both models. Because they're present in both, and because this area is also quite close to the boundary of the regional model, it suggests that this could be a bias from the global models. So we're also planning on looking at an ensemble of other regional models driven by different global models, as these might have different biases and they might potentially do better in this area. So while CP4 isn't improving that much on onset, it is doing quite a bit better for extremes. So this is consecutive wet days during the short rains. The first column is TRIM, then you have CP4 and P25. You should be able to see here that CP4 is matching the satellite much better than P25. So P25, it's just raining a little bit every day, so it's not getting the consecutive wet days right. And we can also see this with the consecutive dry days. So again, CP4 is doing quite a bit better than P25 in this regard. This is because the distribution of rainfall is a bit better. Rather than raining a little bit every day, it has like a storm and then some dry days and then another storm, which is a little bit more realistic. And again, with rainfall intensity, CP4 is doing a bit better. So P25 isn't intense enough, but CP4 might be a little bit too intense, but it still seems to be matching a bit better than P25. So in terms of how we'll use all this to look at agricultural suitability, this is just an example for maize in Tanzania. So some of the important aspects of climate for maize in Tanzania are temperature and rainfall during the growing season, and heat stress and frost stress during the growing season, which is the rainy season. So those first four figures just show those variables during the rainy season. So frost stress isn't very important in Tanzania in the CP4 model. And then we combine all of this information together to get a map of maize suitability, so optimal and unsuitable areas. If we do this for the present day and the future and compare, we can see whether the areas that are unsuitable or good for growing maize are expanding or contracting. So just to finish up, we're using two climate models to look at the impact of climate change on agriculture in the AFRICAP countries. CP4 isn't improving that much for the onset of rainfall, but it is improving quite a bit for extremes. CP4 also has quite a high resolution, so we can potentially look at sub-national impacts, and we're hoping to use this to look at the impact of extremes on agriculture in the country. So that's it, and thank you for listening.
Great, thanks very much to the three speakers. I'm going to ask you to come back up again if that's all right. We've had quite a few questions coming through from our webinar participant, and my colleague Dr. Hemant Tripathi is going to share those with us. So I think we'll start with one or two of those perhaps, and then come back to the room here in Leeds.
We have a couple of questions here. One is from Hillary, and it is about how confident are you in representing the whole country with only 400 serving only 400 farmers? So especially in case of South Africa, which has about 4 million farmers. And then further question, what can be a good representative to make decisions at the national level?
Shall I take it? The household survey is not intended to be representative of the entire country, so it won't. But I think using national level data from census or integrated household surveys is probably a better bet for that level of national level decision making as opposed to 400 households.
Great. Should we come back to?
Yeah.
We'll have to take a couple from the room perhaps before we go back to the webinar participants.
Hi, I think I might have missed this came a bit late, sorry, but I'm just wondering how you're choosing the households within the villages.
At village level, the households will be randomly selected, but the village selection that protocol is still ongoing and is going to be stratified for certain things, but each country has its own sampling strategy.
Okay, so we different in each.
Yeah, but at village level it's random.
Okay.
So I think there's a long history of household surveys in some of those countries.
Mm-hmm.
Have you or will you be able to kind of use those?
Yeah, so a lot of the kind of livelihoods and more generic questions, i.e. not ones about aflatoxin, probably, they are based on existing kind of integrated household survey data. So the data should be comparable. Well, the way that we're asking questions should be comparable.
Just to add on that, I will send you, I've got a link from somebody at the World Agroforestry Centre in Nairobi, and they're collating a lot of what they've done around climate smart agriculture. So household surveys looking at climate smart agriculture in particular. And they've used a certain tool which is different to the Fan Habit tool. So I think there will be a piece of work out there in terms of that, partly the scaling up, as to say, well, what can we learn from other surveys that have done similar things? Maybe just, Joseph, just to add some field reality. I've not talked to you since you came back from Malawi.
Yeah.
And also it links to Sarah's presentation, the fact that climate and shocks is the last thing that you talk about in a survey that might have taken 2 hours. Are people able to recognise that some of the shocks to their system recently are due to change in climate, rainfall, etc., or have they lost all interest after 2 hours and just say, go away. What was your sense in the field? Were people able to recognize climate shocks, basically?
From what I've seen so far, yeah, people recognize that something is changing. Yeah. In terms of the rainfall, for example, the frequency of rainfall, and also when is rainfall starting, when it is stopping, all of these is changing. Some farmers have also noticed that the moisture content of their grain, for example, at harvest, is also changing. Previously, they were having it much more dry than now. So it's they actually noticed that when they were expecting for the rain to come, the rain is not coming at that time. And when they're expecting the rain to go, it's that time the rain is actually coming. So at least at that level, they could notice some changes.
Great, should we take a couple more comments from the webinar?
Yes, there's one more question regarding the survey design. So have so-called local people had any opportunity to feed into how the survey has been designed?
Yeah, so when we were piloting it in Malawi, we did focus group discussions with community members to kind of run through the survey structure, the way the questions were asked, and got feedback from them on what questions they thought we were potentially missing. So for example, with the climate shocks, kind of getting input from them on what shocks we should be asking for or looking out for example. Yeah.
Great. Anything back here in the room? I know we've got some more webinar questions for Sarah.
Yeah, there's so how climate is going to affect coffee production in East Africa?
Oh, I haven't actually looked at coffee yet, so I can't really answer that. At the moment, I'm looking at maize, but I am hoping to expand that to some other food crops, so we can look at whether maybe one food crop is being negatively affected, but maybe another one can replace that. But at the moment, I haven't looked at coffee, so I can't say anything about that one. Sorry.
There's one simple question about the data set. So is the data set going to be public?
Eventually, yes, but anonymized.
Yeah, so sort of, could you say a little bit about how, in terms of forecasting climate, a little bit, how do you, simply, how do you, sort of variables do you use to do that?
So forecasting, are you talking about like climate change projections at the end of the century, or are you talking like a 6-month forecast kind of thing?
Both, I suppose, unless they're very different.
So I don't really, I do more like the climate change stuff, like the end of century or mid-century type of thing, but the variables I'm looking at mostly, starting with some of the basic things like just temperature and precipitation, as well as amounts of precipitation, but how it's distributed throughout the year, is the seasonality changing, and then also looking at things more related to the circulation, so the winds and that sort of thing. Does that answer your question?
So that's what, is that what you're measuring or forecasting for?
Yeah, that's what those are the variables I'm looking at.
So what do you use to predict those? What are the...
Oh, well, I'm just using those climate models to get those variables from. Yeah.
I get it.
Okay.
It's interesting that the region we're working in Tanzania is particularly challenging in terms of the models are not representing what is the reality, which is fantastic because in some ways that makes it a great case study. And I wonder what the next steps then for the work that you're doing. Maybe you could give us a sense of what that means for that work.
So what I'm looking at now, I'm looking at the Cortex ensemble. So it's an ensemble of different regional climate models driven by other global models over Africa. So I'm looking at some of those to see if any of those will do any better over that region. As it's a boundary area, which is what was making it interesting, it's possible they all might struggle with that region. If that ends up being the case, I think it's going to have to affect the interpretation of the results and how confident we can be in that. But yeah, at the moment, I'm looking at that regional ensemble to see if that will be any better or not.
That feeds really interestingly into how you plan with uncertainty.
Yeah.
And I think, yeah.
The Met Office, the people in the Met Office who are working on this project are also looking a bit more at uncertainty, I think, and how that will affect decision making as well. There's more work going on there.
It does link, I mean, it links to the FCFA work that we've done with the Met Office, looking at those uncertainties. And Malawi's kind of on the same coast as to, you know, sometimes it's influenced by Southern African weather, sometimes by East African weather. And it's getting those processes out in the Indian Ocean, sea surface temperatures right, and things like that, isn't it? In terms of what's driving the parameters in the models, as to can they get it right as to what's happening here and now? And then if you increase temperature, what does that mean for 20 years, 30 years? So I think it might be easier for South Africa and Zambia because they're in a sort of more stable Southern African climate to predict there, but definitely the Met Office and others' work is picking out Tanzania and Malawi is particularly difficult to predict.
Then I answered the question on methodology. I was looking at sections on the survey, and so I think it's a very useful method that of most of the sections. But when it comes to food consumption, we have at least 30 years evidence that qualitative methods are much more effective in avoiding bias, social bias. About biofeedback in Canada region, and maybe see again during the meeting this there's a huge sense of cultural shame around hunger. So there's absolutely no possibility that somebody will tell you last night I have eaten. That's impossible. So I was wondering whether there could be a reflection on mixing methods and having a mixed method section perhaps in the bigger steps within the project to address this aspect. I have another question, but
we have a PhD student in the room, Ndashe, who is he's working in Zambia, and he's following up potentially with more qualitative and in-depth investigation into kind of nutrition reporting and dietary reporting.
I mean, yeah, in the Tanzania region, we've certainly had some PhD work going on over the last 2 years. Work, so we can, there will be a way of checking that, see how much of a problem that is, but it's a really good observation and one to keep in mind.
Should we have your second question?
Yeah, it's methodology of the question. Yeah. How do you discuss the topic, the importance of gender research informant, especially because in other languages there's no translation resilience as a concept?
We are working on that. We've only translated it into Chechewa at the moment, but we have our in-country partners that will be their kind of one of the next steps is translating it and getting those terminologies into a phrasing or a words that are representable and representative.
What did they do? Is it just something like reliability of maize yield? Something, you know, how reliable is your field at producing outputs? Or
I think, well, one of the things, particularly in Malawi, that has come up as an issue is conservation agriculture. It is called different things in different places, and it means different things to different people. So piloting is a feasible way of trying to reduce those uncertainties, but ultimately it may be not just a straightforward question, but if the enumerators are trained to kind of understand what the terminology means, then perhaps it can be more of a discussion in advance. But yeah. It does, very nicely so.
Maybe
Yeah.
just elaborate.
So myself, I'm working in Tanzania largely, but we have another PhD student in, did I say Tanzania? I'm working in Tanzania, she's working in Malawi, and we're interested in kind of how agricultural terminology and teaching is communicated in different languages through different extension processes. So things like, as a good example from Malawi is in Chichewa, they don't have local words for things like carbon or nitrogen, and instead they use metaphors. So you add salt into the soil because you add salt to your food, and it makes your food taste nice, but obviously you don't want to add salt to your soil. But that's how they phrase it. So looking at language and the impacts on communication and understanding and on learning, and ultimately on uptake of new technologies and innovations.
Okay, is there more questions on the webinar?
There's one question very relevant to conservation agriculture. So conservation agriculture requires diverse rotation. So are you documenting farmer readiness and attitudes to changing crop choices and rotations in the future?
Yeah, that is being documented. And I can say that from my recent visit in Malawi, we have seen that, for example, in the CIMIT trial, in which they are using in-farm conservation agriculture experiment, it has been noticed that farmers around, they are already copying it and applying in their field, even without the support of CIMIT, because they have seen the positive effect, the positive result that it's given. So that also will be documented.
And alongside the survey, we've got a number of other projects, both kind of postdoc and project level, and also PhD. There's another PhD student in the room, Ruth, and the other Teza, who's in Malawi at the moment, looking at decision making around agricultural uptake and how people make decisions and why they choose not to or to adopt something. And I think there's past PhD students also in Leeds who've done similar things as well, Andy.
Yeah. Malawians who are back out there.
Yeah.
There's a question for Sarah, I guess. Is it possible to categorize the analysis according to agroecological zones?
I have been looking into that as potentially using the Tanzanian government definitions of agroecological zones. At the moment, I haven't done that, as quite a bit of the input is not related to climate. It's about soil pH and altitude and things like that. So it's a little bit harder to get my own, which I can use in the analysis. But it is something I'm still looking at. What is the best way to look at how agriculture will change in the future and how to communicate that? So possibly.
Great. Should we come back to you? Yeah.
A question on the climate data. I'm interested in the wind pattern in Africa in general. Is that, and excuse my ignorance in the CP25 and CP4 and those terminologies. So should I take it that you have data included in these models on wind direction, speed and stuff, or that was not?
Yeah, so that is included. The models calculate that to do the circulation. I have got some plots of that, I just didn't show it today. So there are some plots of that for wind. If you are interested in East Africa, specifically there are some papers that look at winds and how they change over that area, which was part of I used as a comparison to see how the model was doing.
Any more questions here or online? Oh, yeah.
Well, it's a very interesting one. You're aware of this project from John Lovett. I think there's a lot of synergy among different projects, for example, the weather conditions and also the biomass. The cross, those things, maybe the information we fit into John Lovett's project producing these microgrid systems for supply energy. So just public that.
I think the main link onto the energy side, Emmanuel's doing a PhD in Malawi looking at using water for irrigation, and that has a real, it might build resilience to the food system, but it has a real knock-on downstream for energy. So we should be using more micro hydro power locally, because most of Malawi, at least 95% of the energy comes from hydropower. So the links of using water for food versus using it for energy or for water itself is a trade-off that we'll capture a little bit more in the modelling section. You haven't really seen the modelling section of work here, but there may be some links there as to that trade-off between use of water for agriculture and what it means for energy or energy downstream.
Because obviously, the other group that John Lovett's groups probably looks at Indonesia and also some other countries, but obviously there are some commonality, on the weather pattern. well as the weather patterns as it cross, biomass, unlike hydro rainfall. Yeah, I was just commenting on for a role impact of the work we've done. Others.
Anything else online, comments?
There's one again for Sarah. So about in Tanzania, since the rainfall is bimodal, so how do you take into account the inaccuracy in the data?
So that's something I'm looking at now. So that's one of the reasons I want to look at the ensemble of regional models to see if any of them do get that bimodal area better. If they do, I could potentially use those models a bit more. If they don't, if none of the regional models get that bimodal unimodal split quite right, that's probably going to affect the interpretation and how much I can trust the results for those particular areas of Tanzania. So it's a question I'm looking into right now.
Any others? Mike?
We've just got one more question on this household survey. I'm just wondering if you're questioning just one person within the household you're looking at.
It's hopefully both heads at the same time.
So when you ask about asset ownership, that's
Yeah.
directly. They said when you piloted it that some women were hesitant to talk about it with their husband. How do you plan to go around that?
Not sure yet.
Is a modeling question. How do you basically define resilience, and how do you connect your modeling results to the resilience and sustainability?
Do you want to start with resilience?
No.
No. So I haven't really been defining resilience as part of my climate change work. In terms of how the modeling work is connected to the rest of it, it's being connected in terms of what parameters I look at and what aspects of climate are most important. In terms of how resilient people will then be, well, part of that will be looking at more than one food crop, so trying to look at more of the major food crops and see if one could potentially be a replacement crop, but that's still an ongoing question how to relate the climate modeling work back to the social side.
On the resilience front, I think there are many ways to look at resilience, and I think we probably won't just look at one, and I think different projects will look at different aspects of resilience, and perhaps that could be another seminar. quite a large answer.
Great. Any others here in the questions? Okay, we're probably going to wrap up there quite early, I think. Thanks very much for coming along. The next steps from today, Farming First, which is a coalition representing 180 organisations for sustainable agricultural development, is going to produce a blog on the contents of today. We'll also be sharing the slides and the webinar recording on our website and emailing it out to our webinar attendees. Any further information you'd like about the programme can be found on our website, where we also have a contact form if you'd like to get into our mailing list, and of course our Twitter account. And finally, just a plug for the next AFRICAP seminar, which will be on the 27th of February, also Wednesday, same time. Venue to be confirmed, and that will be an external speaker. It's Dr. Andrew Coulson. He's an honorary senior research fellow in international development from the University of Birmingham, and he'll be presenting on his recently published book on Tanzanian agriculture. There'll be more details posted on Twitter and the website. Thank you very much.